My sister-in-law gagged at my mother's homemade biryani in front of the whole family and called it disgusting foreign garbage, but she had no idea I already had proof that would destroy her lies forever. Bethany held her nose the second the food hit the table. "What is that smell?" she gasped. "It's making me sick." My mother stood in the kitchen doorway wiping her hands on her apron. She'd cooked for 3 days straight. Her fingers still smelled like cardamom and slow-cooked lamb. She'd carried the pot in herself, both hands wrapped around the handles, careful not to spill a drop. Bethany pointed at the biryani like it was something dead on the road. "You people actually eat this?" The table went silent. Forks froze halfway to mouths. My husband Daniel stared down at his plate. He wouldn't look at me. "Maybe Bethany should just have pizza," he said, her stomach sensitive. His parents nodded like that made any sense at all. Bethany bolted for the bathroom, gagging loudly enough for the whole house to hear. I know what a person sounds like when they're actually sick. This wasn't that. The fan never even turned on. She came back fanning her face with both hands. "I need to burn these clothes. The smell's in my hair." "This is traditional food," I said. "It's not dirty." She laughed, short and sharp. "Primitive is the word you're looking for." She grabbed her phone and started snapping photos of the table. "My followers need to see this." Her blog had 12 followers. I'd checked. All fake accounts, all created the same week. She jabbed a finger at the dal. "What is that brown sludge? Looks like mud." "It's lentils," my mother said quietly, and I heard something in her voice buckle for just a second before she caught it. "Poverty food," Bethany said. "Even shelters serve better than this." Daniel's mother, Carol, reached over and patted Bethany's hand. "You're so brave for sitting through this." They had eaten my mother's cooking for 5 years. Nobody at that table had complained once. Not until Bethany showed up 2 years ago and decided complaining was a personality. Daniel used to ask for this exact biryani every single week when we were dating. Now he wouldn't even look at the pot. "You used to love this," I said to him, quiet enough that only he could hear. "That was before I knew better," he muttered. "Bethany's been teaching me about clean eating." Clean eating. As if my mother's recipes, passed down from her own mother in Hyderabad, were something that needed sanitizing. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, and I thought about the folder sitting in my car. I thought about 3 weeks of quiet, careful work. I thought about how badly Bethany believed she'd already won this, and how wrong she was about to be. I didn't say anything yet. Not yet. I wanted her to keep talking. People like Bethany always give you more rope if you just let them keep pulling. She wasn't finished. Not even close. And I was ready for every word that was coming. To understand how we got to that table, you have to go back further than that Sunday. You have to go back almost 5 years, to when I was still Mira Rao, and not yet Mira Whitfield, and none of this had a name yet. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, in a house that always smelled like someone was cooking something wonderful, because someone always was. My mother, Anjali Rao, came to this country in 1998 with 2 suitcases and a folder of recipe cards written in her mother's handwriting. She worked as a line cook for 6 years, first at a diner off the interstate, then at a country club that never once let her name appear on the banquet menu even when guests specifically requested her dishes by description, before she saved enough to start her own small catering operation out of our kitchen. I remember being 8 years old and falling asleep at the kitchen table some nights to the sound of her chopping onions for an order due at 6 the next morning. By the time I was in high school, Anjali's kitchen had a real commercial license, a rented industrial kitchen space on Route 9, and a client list that included half the wedding venues within 40 miles. She became a certified food safety manager in 2010, recertified twice since, and in 15 years of business, she never once failed an inspection. Not once. She used to keep the certificates framed on the office wall like other people keep diplomas, because to her, that's exactly what they were. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 27. At a charity fundraiser his family's hardware store sponsored every spring. Whitfield & Sons had been open in Millbrook since 1962, started by Daniel's grandfather, now run day-to-day by his father Gary, with Daniel and his older brother Grant, both working the floor and the books. Daniel was easy to like. He laughed loud. He remembered small details about people, and on our 3rd date he ordered the exact wrong entree just to see what I'd do about it, then ate half of mine anyway. We got married 2.5 years later, in a backyard ceremony with string lights, and of course my mother's cooking. Gary Whitfield ate 4 plates of her biryani that day and told anyone who'd listen it was the best food he'd had at a wedding, including his own. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Sunday dinners at the Whitfield house were the best part of my week. My mother cooked, Carol set the table, and Daniel's father told the same 3 stories about the hardware store's early years, and everyone laughed at the same 3 moments every single time. I felt for a long stretch of my life like I had won some kind of lottery. 2 families that actually liked each other. It's rarer than people think. I remember one dinner in particular, the December before Grant and Bethany got engaged, when a January ice storm knocked out power across half of Millbrook, and my mother still drove out to the Whitfield house with 2 coolers of pre-cooked biryani and lamb curry, because she'd promised Carol she would, and a promise mattered more to her than a downed power line. We ate that meal by candlelight in the Whitfield's kitchen, all of us crowded around a card table because the dining room was too cold, Gary telling stories about the blizzard of '78 while Daniel fed the fireplace, and my mother laughing so hard at one point that she had to set her fork down. Carol hugged her at the door that night and told her the house had never felt more like a home than it had in the dark with her food on the table. I used to replay that memory a lot later, when I needed a reminder of what all of this had actually been before it broke. It wasn't performance. It wasn't obligation. It was just 2 families, briefly, genuinely glad to be inside the same walls. Grant met Bethany at a conference in Columbus a little over 2 years ago. She worked in wellness marketing, ran a small blog about intuitive eating that had maybe a few hundred real followers back then, and within 4 months they were engaged. The first time she came to a family dinner, in April of that year, she ate 2 full plates of my mother's chicken biryani and asked twice if she could have the recipe. It's proprietary, my mother told her gently. It's how I make my living, sweetheart, but you're welcome at my table anytime. Bethany smiled at the time. I remember thinking it looked a little tight around the edges, like she wasn't used to hearing no. She asked again a month later, framing it differently, as a just for personal use, not for anything public kind of request. I completely understand if it's a business thing, she said, sitting across from my mother at our own kitchen table, her tone soft and reasonable. I just feel like I finally get why Grant loves coming to these dinners so much. I want to be able to make him feel that at home too. It was a good line. I remember thinking at the time that it was sweet. My mother still said no, gently, the same way she had the first time. I understand completely, my mother told her, but this is how I feed my own daughter, sweetheart. A recipe like this, it's not just instructions. It took my mother 30 years to get it right, and me another 15. Every measurement in my head accounts for humidity, for the age of the rice, for 100 small things no card could ever hold. I can teach you to cook beside me anytime you like. I just can't hand you the card. Bethany nodded, smiled, said she understood completely. She asked a third time 2 months later at a different dinner, phrasing it as though the first two conversations had never happened. My mother declined a third time, just as kindly, and I watched something flicker behind Bethany's eyes that I didn't have a name for yet. I do now. It was the exact moment she stopped seeing my mother as a person to charm and started seeing her as an obstacle to root around. I didn't think much of it at the time. People ask for recipes all the time. I didn't understand yet that for Bethany, being told no wasn't information. It was an insult she filed away. That was the incident I think about now, the one that reads different in hindsight than it did in the moment. At the time it looked like enthusiasm. Looking back, it looked like the first move in something much longer, because after that, something in Bethany started to shift, slow enough that none of us noticed it happening in real time. It started small, the way these things always do. About 4 months after the engagement, Bethany posted a photo on her blog of a plate that looked suspiciously like my mother's dishes, captioned "Elevated Comfort Food, coming soon to Pure Table Living." No credit. No mention of where the inspiration came from. I didn't say anything. It felt petty to make a fuss over a photo caption. Then came the dietary sensitivities. At Thanksgiving that year, Bethany announced out of nowhere that she'd developed a sudden intolerance to heavy spices, and could the family maybe consider a lighter menu going forward, out of consideration for her? Carol, always eager to smooth things over, agreed immediately. My mother offered to make a milder version, and did, and Bethany still barely touched her plate, pushing food around while sighing audibly enough that 3 people asked if she was okay. I told myself it was a phase. New people take time to settle into a family. I gave her the benefit of every doubt I had. By spring of the following year, the sensitivities had become something bigger. Bethany started a blog series called Clean Family Table, where she wrote in vague, glowing terms about returning to simple, wholesome, familiar food for family gatherings, without ever naming my mother directly, but everyone who read it knew exactly who she meant. Carol started forwarding me the posts, thinking I'd find them inspiring. I did not tell Carol what I actually thought. I was still trying to keep the peace. The real turn happened at Carol and Gary's 40th anniversary party, catered as always by Angeli's Kitchen. Bethany pulled Carol aside that night, and I only found out what was said because Carol repeated it to me weeks later, feeling guilty. Bethany had told her that some of the older guests, the ones from Gary's side of the family, might be more comfortable with something more familiar. Carol, not wanting to offend anyone, quietly asked my mother to add a tray of standard American sides alongside the main menu. My mother did it without complaint, because that's who she is. But it was the first time in 5 years anyone had suggested her food wasn't good enough on its own. I remember driving home that night and asking Daniel if he'd noticed anything strange with Bethany lately. He shrugged. She's just particular. Grant says she's always been that way. I let it go. I had no proof of anything yet, just a feeling. And feelings don't hold up well against a room full of people who've decided you're being sensitive. The pattern kept building through that year, one small ceiling after another, each one broken through so quietly I only recognized the shape of it afterward. The first real ceiling broke in June, when the Whitfields' extended family reunion, an event my mother had catered for 11 straight years, went to a different company instead. Carol called to tell me, apologetic, explaining that Bethany had recommended a caterer she'd worked with through her blog, someone offering a modern, allergy-conscious menu. I asked what allergies specifically needed accommodating. Carol didn't have an answer. It cost my mother almost $3,000 in lost business that single event, money she'd already budgeted around, having turned down another job that same weekend to keep the date open for family. I called Bethany directly, trying to handle it like an adult, one-on-one, before it became a bigger thing. I asked calmly if there was a specific concern with my mother's food that we could talk through. It's not personal, she told me, her voice syrupy and even. I just think it's time this family modernized a little. No offense to your mom, obviously. She's sweet. Sweet. Like my mother was a decoration instead of a woman who'd built a business from nothing in a country that wasn't hers. I responded reasonably. I told her I understood everyone has preferences, but that cutting my mother out of a family event without discussion felt hurtful, especially given how long she'd been part of these gatherings. Bethany apologized, told me I was totally right, and promised it wouldn't happen again. It happened again in August, at a smaller birthday dinner, this time framed as a surprise, so my mother wouldn't be put on the spot, catering her own family's event. I found out about the party from a photo Carol posted online. My mother's absence conspicuous in a way nobody but me seemed to register. The second ceiling broke when Bethany started working on Daniel directly, and this was the one that actually hurt. It started with small comments, dropped in casually when I wasn't around. Grant mentioned it to me once, not realizing what he was telling me. Bethany thinks your mom's kind of intense sometimes, he said, like it was nothing. Like, a lot of opinions about how things should go. I asked Daniel about it that night. He got defensive in a way he never used to get with me. She didn't mean anything bad by quiet, he said. You're being sensitive, being sensitive. I would hear that phrase so many times over the following months that it started to lose meaning, the way any word does when it's used as a weapon instead of a description. Bethany had found the oldest trick in the book, and she used it well. She told Daniel, in pieces, over months, that my mother was overbearing, that I leaned on my family too much, that a healthy marriage needed boundaries from in-laws. She never said any of it where I could hear it directly. She said it to Daniel, alone, in 100 small conversations that each sounded reasonable on their own and added up to something poisonous. I responded the only way I knew how, by trying to talk to Daniel honestly, without accusing anyone of anything. I told him I felt like something was shifting between us, and I asked him to just notice, over the next few weeks, whether the things he believed about my family were things he'd actually witnessed himself or things he'd been told. He looked at me like I was asking him to take a side in a war he didn't know he was fighting. In hindsight, that was exactly what I was asking. The third ceiling broke over money, because with people like Bethany, it usually does eventually. Whitfield & Sons had been quietly working through a succession conversation for over a year. Gary was 68, tired, ready to hand the store to the next generation, and the plan on the table involved splitting management between Daniel and Grant, with a family trust eventually dividing ownership between both sons. It was never formalized, but everyone understood the shape of it. Around the time Bethany's campaign against my mother started accelerating, I noticed Carol beginning to ask strange, pointed questions at dinner. Questions about whether Daniel and I were planning to have kids soon. Questions about whether I thought Daniel was distracted by extra family obligations. Questions that sounded like small talk and weren't. I didn't understand the shape of what was happening yet. I only understood that the temperature in every room I entered with the Whitfields had changed, and I couldn't point to a single sentence that explained why. There was one night that summer, our 5th anniversary, when Daniel forgot to make dinner reservations for the first time in 5 years, and when I asked him about it, gently, he got strangely defensive, said he'd had a lot on his mind lately, and wouldn't say what. We ended up eating leftovers at our own kitchen table in near silence, and I remember looking across at him, this man who used to text me song lyrics in the middle of the workday for no reason at all, and feeling like I was sitting across from someone slowly being replaced by a stranger who happened to share his face. I didn't know yet that Bethany had spent that same week telling him, in one of their casual 100 conversation drip campaigns, that maybe the reason our marriage felt off lately was that I prioritized my family over him. I only knew that something was wrong, and that I had no proof of what, and that not having proof, in a family that valued politeness over confrontation, meant I had almost nothing to work with at all. The fourth ceiling broke at the hardware store itself, in front of customers, which was the first time Bethany's campaign stopped being something whispered behind closed doors and became something public. Whitfield & Sons hosted a community appreciation weekend every June, a small local tradition, free hot dogs in the parking lot, a raffle for a new grill, and for the past 4 years, a table from Angeli's Kitchen offering samples to draw foot traffic, an arrangement Gary had set up personally because he liked the way it brought families through the door. That June, Bethany arrived early, told the event coordinator there'd been a last-minute change, and had my mother's sample table quietly moved from the front of the lot near the entrance to a corner behind the tool rental shed, barely visible from the street. When my mother arrived to set up and found her table relocated, she said nothing. She simply carried her chafing dishes to the corner and set up there instead, because making a scene wasn't something she knew how to do, even when a scene was exactly what the moment called for. I found out what happened because a longtime customer, a woman named Deb Halloran who'd been buying paint from the Whitfields for 20 years, mentioned it to me weeks later, confused and a little annoyed on my mother's behalf. I had to ask 3 people where the Indian food was this year, Deb told me. Used to be right up front. Somebody said there'd been complaints. There had been no complaints. I checked. I asked Gary directly, and he looked genuinely blindsided, said he'd had nothing to do with the move, and had assumed Bethany was helping coordinate logistics that day as a favor to the family. When I brought it up with Bethany, she told me without missing a beat that she'd simply thought the corner spot would be cozier, more intimate, and that she hadn't realized it would come across as a demotion. I responded the way I always did that year, calmly, factually, asking her to check with my mother directly next time before making decisions about her business on her behalf. She apologized. She always apologized. The apologies never once came with anything actually changing. The 5th ceiling broke with the health department call. In late July, an anonymous complaint was filed against Angeli's Kitchen, alleging unsafe food handling practices at a private event. My mother had to shut down operations for 2 full days while a county inspector conducted a surprise review. She passed with a perfect score, as she always did, but the 2 days cost her $4,000 in canceled orders, and the emotional toll of it aged her in a way I hadn't seen before. Anonymous complaints don't come with a name attached. I had no proof it was Bethany. I had a feeling so strong it kept me up at night. That was the moment I stopped giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. I started paying attention differently after that. Not confronting anyone, not accusing anyone out loud, just watching, quietly, the way you watch a pattern once you finally understand you're inside one. And once I started really watching, I noticed something small that I filed away without fully understanding its size yet. Bethany's phone, left open on the kitchen counter one evening while she went to the bathroom, showing a folder in her photo app labeled simply Daniel. I only saw it for 3 seconds before the screen locked again. I didn't think much of it at the time. I know now I should have. 3 weeks before that Sunday dinner, my niece Priya, my brother Arjun's daughter, 16 years old and working on an AP video production project about family food traditions, mentioned offhand that she had almost a year of footage from family gatherings, unedited, sitting on her old phone. Just clips, she said. Dinners and holidays, nothing special. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether Bethany appeared in any of it. She scrolled for a minute, then looked up at me strangely. Yeah, actually, a lot. She loves your grandma's food in, like, every every video I have. Show me, I said, trying to keep my voice light, like it was a small curiosity and not the first solid thread I'd been handed in over a year. Priya pulled up a clip from a birthday dinner the previous winter. Bethany leaning over a serving dish, eyes closed, telling someone off camera that she could eat this every single day of her life. Another clip, this one from a cookout. Bethany asking my mother, on camera, unprompted, whether she'd ever considered opening a second location. A third clip, quieter, just background noise from a Christmas gathering. Bethany's voice drifting into frame while she thought no one was listening, telling Grant she wished she could get my mother to write the measurements down in real units so she could actually replicate it at home. I sat on the edge of Priya's bed for a long time after she went back to her homework, scrolling through 11 months of casual, unposed footage on my own phone, screenshotting timestamps, building a private folder of my own before I even knew exactly what I was building it for. Somewhere in that hour, sitting in my niece's room surrounded by her school textbooks, I stopped being someone reacting to Bethany and became someone building a case against her. And the difference between those two things turned out to matter enormously. That was the moment the shape of everything finally clicked into place for me. Bethany hadn't stopped liking the food. She had never stopped liking the food. She had built an entire public identity on rejecting it while privately consuming it. And if that contradiction was true, then everything else she'd said over the past 2 years deserved a second, harder look. I started gathering quietly and methodically over the following 3 weeks. Priya sent me every clip that featured my mother's cooking. 17 files in total once she'd gone back through everything on her old phone. I went through my mother's business files on a Tuesday afternoon while she was out running deliveries and found something I'd forgotten existed, a catering contract from 4 months earlier. For a private book club dinner, Bethany had personally hired Anjali's Kitchen for under her maiden name, Bethany Corliss, not Whitfield, which explained why my mother hadn't connected the booking to her son's fiancé at the time. The intake form was filled out in Bethany's own looping handwriting, requesting, word for word, the most flavorful, spicy, traditional dishes available, nothing watered down, please. I sat at my mother's desk holding that form for a long time, feeling something settle into place in my chest that was calmer than anger, closer to certainty. I found her 5-star review on my mother's catering page next, posted under the handle B. Corliss Eats, 43 likes, 6 comments from women I recognized by name as her book club friends, one of them writing, best Indian food in the state, don't tell anyone, or we'll never get a reservation again. I took a screenshot before it could conveniently disappear, the way I suspected it eventually would once Bethany remembered it existed. Then came the driveway. I was sitting in my car outside the Whitfield house on a Thursday evening in late August, waiting for Daniel to finish a phone call so we could leave for dinner, when Bethany's car pulled in beside mine and she jumped out to run something inside, leaving her driver's side door slightly open and her phone face up on the passenger seat, unlocked, screen still glowing from whatever she'd last been doing. I told myself in the 2 or 3 seconds before I looked that I wasn't the kind of person who read other people's phones. Then I looked anyway, because 18 months of small cruelties had worn that particular scruple down to almost nothing. It was a text thread with Grant. Midway through a longer conversation I couldn't see the start of. The 4 lines visible on the lock screen read, she's still pushing the caterer thing with mom, getting suspicious. We need to move faster on the timeline before Gary makes anything official. Then from Grant, just keep it about the food stuff. Don't mention the store part yet. I read it twice to be sure I wasn't imagining the shape of it. And then Bethany came back out the front door and I looked away fast enough that she never knew I'd seen anything at all. I didn't have the full picture yet. I had enough though to understand that whatever Daniel folder I'd glimpsed weeks earlier wasn't really about Daniel in any personal sense. It was about the store and about timing and about my mother's cooking being useful as cover for something bigger than a food preference. I put everything into a single folder of my own after that. Physical copies, printed photos, the intake form, the screenshots, a flash drive with Priya's videos backed up twice in 2 separate places, once at my own apartment and once, out of a caution I couldn't fully explain even to myself, in a locked drawer at my office. I told no one what I was building, not even Daniel, especially not Daniel. I needed him to see it happen in real time, in front of his own family, not hear about it secondhand from his wife and decide, the way he'd decided about everything else that year, that I was being sensitive, or worse, that I was trying to turn him against his own brother out of spite. I wanted the proof to speak in a room where he couldn't look away from it and couldn't blame me for how it landed. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. That brings us back to that Sunday, September 14th, and the biryani, and Bethany holding her nose like my mother's cooking was something crawling toward her across the table. I let her finish her performance. I let her call the dal poverty food. I let her tell my mother, to her face, that her 15 years of certifications from back home didn't count here. In front of Carol, in front of Gary, in front of Grant, in front of my husband, who still wouldn't meet my eyes. I think we should just order pizza next time, Bethany said, turning to Carol with the practiced patient smile of someone used to being agreed with. Honestly, for everyone's sake, it's not fair to keep putting people through this. Through what exactly? I asked her, and I kept my voice even, because I'd learned by then that Bethany fed on other people's volume and starved on their calm. Through pretending we love food that makes half the table sick, she said. I'm not trying to be cruel, Mira. I'm just being honest. Somebody has to be. You've eaten this exact dish more times than anyone else at this table, I said. She laughed, that same short, sharp laugh from earlier, out of politeness, which apparently doesn't count for anything with your family. It's not my family's job to be palatable to you, I said. It's yours to be honest. I am being honest, she snapped, and for just a second, the smile slipped all the way off, and something underneath it showed through, tired and mean in a way I hadn't seen from her before. God, why is it always like this with you people? Everything's an attack. I say one thing about a smell, and suddenly I'm the villain. Nobody Nobody called you a villain, Daniel said quietly, which was the first thing he'd said in 10 minutes that sounded like it belonged to him instead of to her. Bethany looked at him like he'd slapped her. Excuse me? I just mean, he said, maybe you could dial it back a little. It's my wife's mom. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough. Not yet. Not compared to what was still coming. But it was the first crack of daylight I'd seen from him in months. And I decided, in that moment, it was time. Then I got up, walked to the kitchen, and came back with the folder. I set it down next to Bethany's phone without a word first, letting the silence do some of the work for me. You ordered this exact meal for your book club, I said, opening the folder to the intake form, turning it so everyone at the table could read her own handwriting. 3 months ago, you called it flavorful? Extraordinary, actually. That was your word. Daniel's face went pale in a way I'd never seen before. That's not, Bethany started. I kept going, laying out the 5-star review next to the intake form. Then the screenshot of her Instagram caption from the day before, the one calling the exact same dish disgusting foreign garbage. I read both captions out loud, back to back, in the same flat, even voice, and let the room hear how they didn't fit inside the same person. Priya pulled out her own phone at that point without me even asking her to. I have videos too, Aunt Bethany. She hit play. Bethany at a potluck 18 months earlier, eating 3 full plates of my mother's biryani, moaning about the flavor, asking on camera for the recipe a 3rd time. That's not me, Bethany said. Too fast, too flat. It was obviously her. Same laugh, same dress even, one she still owned. Priya scrolled to another clip, then another. Bethany at a restaurant praising authentic spices to a table of her friends. Bethany at Thanksgiving the year before, whispering to Carol that the food was actually incredible. I just can't say that out loud or she'll never stop cooking it for us. A comment I don't think she ever imagined would be caught on a 16-year-old's phone propped against a centerpiece. Bethany lunged across the table for Priya's phone. Priya yanked it back out of reach, calm as anything. I already sent copies to my dad, Priya said. And to Uncle Daniel, actually. This morning. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket at almost that exact moment, like it had been cued. Bethany's mouth opened and closed twice with nothing coming out. You told my parents she was forcing weird food on everyone, Carol said slowly, and I watched her put the pieces together in real time, watched something in her face shift from confusion into something colder. You told me the smell made you sick. You told me you were being polite for 2 years. I kept my voice level, kept reading from the folder, because I understood by then that the facts alone were doing more damage than any amount of anger from me ever could. 15 years, my mother said, laying her certifications on the table one at a time, like she was dealing cards in a game she had already won. 2,000 clients. 0 health code violations, until an anonymous complaint got filed against me in July. The same month you needed a reason to explain why I wasn't catering the reunion. Bethany's face went a shade of red I hadn't seen on her before. That complaint had nothing to do with me. I never said it did, my mother replied, and let the silence after that do exactly what it needed to do. Grant, who had barely said a word through any of this, sat frozen for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't quite swallow, before he finally reached over and picked up Bethany's purse off the back of her chair. We need to talk, he said. Right now. Bethany reached for her phone one last time, panic all over her face in a way that finally looked real. That's when Priya, still scrolling, looked up, eyes wide. Wait, she said quietly. There's another folder on here. It's labeled Daniel. The whole table went still. Bethany snatched for the phone so hard she knocked over a full glass of water, sending it sheeting across the tablecloth toward the folder of evidence I'd built. Give that back, she screamed, and it was the first honest sound I'd heard her make all night. Grant didn't hand it over. He held it out of her reach and, without asking anyone's permission, opened the folder himself. What loaded onto the screen wasn't photos. It was a document, a running note file, dated back almost 18 months, titled simply, Daniel, Plan. Grant read the first few lines out loud in a voice that got quieter with every sentence, not louder, which was somehow worse. Week 1, comment on the smell at dinner, plant the seed gently. Week 3, mention to Carol that some guests might be more comfortable with familiar food. Month 2, start conversation with D about in-law boundaries, keep it casual, don't push. Month 4, raise concerns with C plus G about D being distracted, tie it to succession timeline. Ongoing, document Angeli's kitchen for potential complaint if needed, keep it anonymous. Grant kept scrolling and kept reading, and the room kept getting colder. His voice cracked once, reading a later entry aloud, one dated just 3 weeks earlier. Keep pushing the boundaries conversation with D. Need him rattled before the June store meeting. Don't let him feel stable right now. There's more, he said, and I watched his hand start to shake around the phone. There's a whole section from July. It's about the health inspector. Grant, stop, Bethany said, and her voice had gone thin and high. Nothing like the syrupy calm she'd used on me in that phone call months earlier. He didn't stop. He read it anyway, flat and careful, like a man diffusing something. Filed the complaint anonymously through the county portal, used the library computer so it can't trace back. Timing is good, gives us a reason for the reunion switch that isn't about Dee's marriage. My mother made a small sound beside me, not quite a gasp, something quieter and worse. $4,000 in canceled orders, 2 sleepless nights wondering what she'd done wrong in a kitchen she'd run flawlessly for 15 years. All of it typed out in a note file, like a project timeline, filed under her son-in-law's own name. There were message threads between Bethany and Grant going back over a year, discussing, in plain and business-like language, how to position Grant as the more stable, focused son for the eventual store transition, and how turning Gary and Carol's attention toward doubts about Daniel's marriage was, in Bethany's own words, the cleanest way to shift the timeline in our favor without anyone thinking it's about the business at all. There were photos too, dozens of them, close-up shots of my mother's handwritten recipe cards, taken during Bethany's fake bathroom trips over 2 years, time-stamped and organized by dish, alongside drafts of a menu for something something called Pure Table Living Catering, launching that November, featuring dishes with names like Grandmother's Golden Rice and Heritage Lentil Bowl. No mention anywhere of where any of it actually came from. There was even a mocked-up press release dated for early December, describing Bethany as a self-taught culinary innovator, reimagining comfort food for the modern table. A sentence I read twice just to make sure I understood exactly what it was built on top of. Gary Whitfield, who had said almost nothing through the entire evening, stood up from his chair slowly, both hands flat on the table, and looked at his older son. "Did you know about this?" he asked Grant, and his voice had none of the warmth I'd heard in it for 5 straight years of Sunday dinners. "Not all of it," Grant said, and the way he said it told everyone at that table it was at least partly a lie. "42 years I've been building that store," Gary said, quiet in a way that was somehow louder than shouting. "I was going to hand it to both of you because I trusted both of you to want it for the right reasons, not because one of you was willing to burn down his brother's marriage to get a bigger piece of it." Grant didn't answer. He set the phone down on the table and stared at his own hands like he didn't recognize them. Daniel stood up so fast his chair screeched across the floor, loud enough that it seemed to snap something loose in him. He looked at Bethany like he was seeing an entirely different person than the one who'd been sitting across from him at holidays for 2 years. "You've been lying this whole time," he said. "It wasn't a question. Every single conversation about Mira's family, every comment about boundaries, that was you, building a case against my marriage so Grant could get a bigger slice of my dad's store." "Daniel, it's not that simple," Bethany started. "It's exactly that simple," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Not from weakness, I think, but from finally hearing, out loud, how thoroughly he'd let himself be steered. "You used my wife's mother's cooking as a weapon against my own marriage. You had me apologizing to Mira for defending my own family from you." Bethany's mouth opened, and for the first time all night, nothing came out at all. I stood up too, then, because I understood this was the moment I'd been building toward for 3 weeks, and I wasn't going to let it slip past without saying, clearly, the thing I actually needed to say. "My mother left everything she knew to build a life here," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised me a little, given how long I'd been holding it steady inside my chest. "She fed this family for 5 years without asking for anything but a seat at the table. You used her food to build a business and used her name to build a story about how this family should look. That's not clean eating, Bethany. That's just theft with better lighting." Nobody said anything for a long moment. My mother reached over and took my hand under the table, and I felt her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, I think, but from finally being allowed to be angry after 2 years of swallowing it politely. Carol was the one who broke the silence, turning to Bethany with an expression I'd never seen on her before, something between grief and disgust. "You told me she made me uncomfortable in my own house," Carol said. "You made me ask her to change the menu at my own anniversary party." "Carol, I can explain," Bethany started. "I don't think you can," Carol said, and stood up too. And for the first time in 2 years, I watched Daniel's mother choose a side, and it wasn't the one Bethany had spent 18 months carefully building. Grant set the phone down on the table, screen still glowing with the open document, evidence of his own involvement sitting right there for everyone to see. He looked at his father, then at Bethany, then back at his father, and something in his face collapsed a little. "I need some air," he said, and walked out the back door alone, leaving Bethany sitting at a table full of people who now saw her exactly as she was. The days after that dinner moved fast, in the specific way that things move once a lie this large finally runs out of road. Grant moved out of the house he shared with Bethany within a week, staying at his parents' place while things sorted themselves out. He told Daniel, in a conversation Daniel relayed to me almost word for word, that he'd known about parts of the plan and gone along with it because Bethany made it sound reasonable, made it sound like protecting the family business instead of what it actually was, which was sabotaging his own brother's marriage for a bigger slice of a company that was never supposed to be divided that way in the first place. Grant didn't file for divorce right away. He told his father he needed time to figure out how much of the last 2 years of his own life had been real. I didn't envy him that math. It's a hard thing to discover you were used as a tool inside someone else's plan, even when you helped hold the tool yourself. Grant came to see my mother the week after the dinner, on his own, unannounced, standing on her porch for a full minute before he knocked. He apologized to her directly, for the health department complaint, for the reunion, for the sample table moved behind the tool shed, for every small cruelty he'd let happen, because objecting to it felt harder than staying quiet. My mother listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she listens to everything, and then she told him the same thing she'd told Carol weeks later, that she forgave him, not because what he'd done didn't matter, but because holding on to it wouldn't cook her a single meal or pay a single bill, and she had both of those things to get back to. Grant cried on her porch, a grown man of 37, and my mother handed him a container of leftover biryani on his way out, the same dish that had started all of it, and told him to eat something before he drove home. He told me later it was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in months, and I believed him, and it made me a little sad for him too, underneath everything else I felt. Gary and Carol called a meeting with their attorney, a man named Feldman who'd handled the Whitfield family's affairs for almost 20 years, and reworked the succession plan entirely. Instead of splitting management and eventual ownership evenly between the brothers as originally discussed, Gary restructured the trust to require both sons to demonstrate stable, transparent involvement over a 5-year window before any ownership transferred, with an outside advisor brought in to oversee the transition and quarterly reviews built into the paperwork for the first time in the store's 62-year history. It wasn't punishment exactly, Gary told Daniel. It was recognition that trust, once it's been manipulated this badly, has to be rebuilt with structure instead of assumption. Feldman also drew up a formal addendum, at Gary's insistence, explicitly excluding spouses from any decision-making authority over the trust, unless directly employed by the business, a clause Gary said he never imagined he'd need to write down in plain English until he did. bad. The lawyer's fees alone that fall ran past $6,000, on top of another $2,000 for a forensic review of the store's books going back 18 months, which turned up nothing criminal, only a handful of vendor decisions that had quietly shifted toward companies with ties to people in Bethany's circle. Small stuff, a few $100s here and there, but enough to explain why Gary wanted the outside advisor in the first place. Nobody complained about the cost. Everyone understood by then what the alternative might have looked like if it had gone unchecked another year. The anonymous health department complaint got formally reopened once the county learned, through channels I still don't fully understand and didn't ask too many questions about, that it may have originated from a personal dispute rather than a genuine safety concern. My mother wasn't in any danger from the reopening, since her original inspection had come back perfect. But the review did something unexpected. A local news outlet, the Millbrook Courier, picked up the story of a 15-year certified caterer who'd never failed a single inspection getting hit with a bad faith complaint, traced back to a library computer 3 blocks from Whitfield & Sons. A reporter named Danielle Osei called my mother directly, spent 2 hours in her kitchen watching her prep for a wedding, and wrote a piece that ran under the headline, "Millbrook Caterer's Perfect Record Survives a Complaint That Wasn't What It Seemed." The article never named Bethany. It didn't need to. Anyone in town who'd heard even a fraction of what happened at that dinner, and by early October, most of Millbrook had heard some version of it, understood exactly who the piece was circling without saying outright. The resulting attention, meant to be a small human interest piece, ended up driving more traffic to Angeli's kitchen than any single event in the business's 15-year history. The phone rang for 3 straight days. My mother booked 11 new clients in the month after that article ran, worth close to $18,000 in contracts. More business in 4 weeks than the entire slow season usually brought in, including a wedding for 200 guests at the same venue that had quietly dropped her the year before over vague dietary concerns nobody had ever bothered to specify. She hired her first part-time assistant that November, a culinary student named Ruth, who still works for her now. There is a particular kind of justice in watching someone's attempt to destroy your mother's reputation become the exact thing that grew it instead, and I won't pretend I didn't enjoy watching it happen. Bethany's Pure Table Living catering launch, scheduled for that November, quietly disappeared from her blog within days of the dinner. I checked more than once, more than I probably should have. The recipe photos she'd stolen off my mother's handwritten cards never made it into any public menu, not once she understood how easily they could be traced back and proven. Her blog itself went dark by early October. The 12 followers, all fake, stopped mattering to anyone but her. One of the stranger developments that fall came from a direction I never expected. Bethany's own mother, a woman named Pam, who I'd met exactly twice in 2 years, called my mother directly in October, having heard a version of what happened through Grant's side of the family grapevine. She apologized at length for her daughter's behavior, and admitted with a kind of tired resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd made a call like this on Bethany's behalf, that Bethany had always had a thing about being the most interesting person in the room, even as a child, and that she'd watched her daughter reinvent herself around 3 or 4 different identities over the years, each one requiring someone else's culture, someone else's work, to be dismissed first, so Bethany's version could look more impressive by comparison. My mother thanked her for the call and told her, kindly, that she didn't need to apologize for a grown woman's choices, but Pam kept talking anyway, like she'd needed to say it more than my mother had needed to hear it. It was a small thing, one phone call from a woman I barely knew, but it confirmed something I'd started to suspect on my own. Whatever Bethany had built with us, whatever campaign she'd run for 18 months, wasn't really new. It was just the latest version of a pattern that had been running, quietly, under different names, for a long time before she ever sat down at my mother's table. Not everything about that fall was justice, though, and I want to be honest about that, because pretending it was would be its own kind of lie. There was a night, about 3 weeks after the dinner, when I sat in my car outside my mother's kitchen and cried for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, not because of Bethany, because of the version of that family I'd let myself believe in for the first 3 years of my marriage, before any of this started, when Sunday dinners were just Sunday dinners and nobody was keeping a folder on anybody. I kept thinking about that ice storm dinner by candlelight, Carol's arms around my mother at the door, Gary's stories about the blizzard of '78, and I couldn't stop turning it over, wondering how much of even that night had been real and how much I'd simply needed it to be. I decided eventually, sitting there with the engine off and the windows fogging, that it had been real. Bethany hadn't poisoned the past. She'd only poisoned what came after it. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to. I grieved that version of things even while I understood it had already been compromised long before I found the proof. You can know something needed to end and still miss what it felt like before it broke. Those two things live in the same chest without much trouble, I found, whether you want them to or not. I didn't tell my mother about that night in the car. Some things I still carry alone, not because I don't trust her with them, but because she carried enough that year without needing to carry my grief on top of her own. Daniel and I spent a long stretch of that autumn in a kind of quiet, careful repair. He apologized for the "you're being sensitive" comments more times than either of us could count, and I believed him because I watched him actually change the way he listened after that, not just the words he used. It took him longer than I wanted to fully reckon with how easily he'd been turned, in small pieces, against his own wife's family, by someone who understood exactly which doubts to plant and how slowly to water them. We went to a few sessions with a marriage counselor that October, a woman named Dr. Alvarez, who worked out of a small office above the pharmacy on 5th Street, not because the marriage was ending, but because I wanted us to understand, together, how a person gets manipulated without ever feeling the manipulation happening in real time. In our third session, Dr. Alvarez asked Daniel a question I've thought about often since. She asked him to name one specific thing he'd personally witnessed my mother do that supported the idea she was over overbearing. The word Bethany had used so many times, it had started to feel like a fact instead of an opinion. Daniel sat with that question for almost a full minute before admitting he couldn't think of a single one. Every example he'd absorbed over those months, every doubt he'd carried into our arguments, had come to him secondhand, filtered through Bethany, dressed up as concern. He looked genuinely shaken by that, in a way I hadn't seen from him before, like he was only then grasping how thoroughly his own memory of 2.5 years with my family had been quietly overwritten by someone else's narrative. It's a strange, humbling thing to sit across from your husband and hear him admit, out loud, in front of a stranger, that he'd let someone else's narrative replace 2.5 years of his own lived experience with my family. I respected him more for saying it than I would have if he'd never needed to. We're still working on it, honestly, even now. Trust doesn't rebuild on a fixed schedule, but I believe him when he tells me he checks himself now, catches the reflex before it turns into a repeated line at dinner, and that counts for something. It counts for a lot, actually. Carol became, unexpectedly, one of the people I grew closest to that winter. She showed up at my mother's kitchen one Tuesday in late October, unannounced, and asked quietly if she could learn how to make the biryani properly, the real way, not the version she'd asked to be watered down at her own anniversary party. My mother said yes without a moment's hesitation, because that's who she is, and the two of them spent an entire afternoon together, flour and cardamom dust settling over both of their hands, Carol asking careful questions about Hyderabad, about my grandmother, about the 15 years it took to build a business out of 2 suitcases and a stack of recipe cards. Carol apologized to my mother that afternoon, plainly, without excuses, for every menu change she'd agreed to and every silence she'd kept. I told myself I was keeping the peace, she said, standing at my mother's stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, not looking up from the pot. I wasn't. I was just letting someone else decide who got to feel comfortable at my own table, and it was never you I was protecting, my mother told her, and I believe she meant it completely, that she forgave her, because Carol had been lied to as carefully as the rest of us, just from a different angle. You didn't build the lie, my mother said. You just believed it, the way anyone might. The difference is what you do once you know better. Today, you're standing in my kitchen asking questions. That tells me everything I need to know. Carol cried a little at that, and hugged my mother the same way she had that night during the ice storm, and the two of them have cooked together at least once a month ever since. An odd, unlikely friendship built out of the wreckage of something that should never have happened in the first place. Grant and Bethany's divorce was finalized the following spring, quiet and uncontested in the end. Once the messages and the strategy document made any real fight over the terms pointless for her to pursue. Bethany moved to Columbus that January, back to the city where she and Grant had met, and started over under a slightly different name on her blog, Pure Table Wellness instead of Pure Table Living, a rebrand I only know about because Priya, out of some teenage instinct for closure, checked once and told me about it, unprompted, over a bowl of my mother's dal. The new blog had, according to Priya, 41 followers within its first month. I didn't ask if any of them were real. Grant stayed on at the hardware store, working through the new 5-year trust structure his father had set, and he and Daniel rebuilt something like their old relationship slowly, in the unglamorous way brothers usually do, mostly through long silences at the store and small gestures neither of them named directly, a coffee left on the other's workbench, a ride offered without being asked. I don't know if Grant ever fully forgave himself for the part he played, and I don't think that's mine to fix or forgive on his behalf. That's a debt he owes to his own conscience, paid on his own timeline. He still comes to Sunday dinner most weeks now, alone, and he always, without fail, asks my mother what she's made before he sits down, and he always finishes his plate. I think about that Sunday dinner often, more than a year later now, not with the sharp anger I carried out of that dining room, but with something calmer, more settled, closer to clarity than to victory. My mother still runs Anjali's kitchen out of the same building on Route 9, busier now than she's ever been, with a framed copy of that newspaper article hanging next to her certifications on the office wall, a strange little trophy from a season that tried to break her and only ended up proving how unbreakable she already was. Daniel and I are expecting our first child this coming spring, and my mother has already started planning the food for the celebration dinner. Unbothered, unhesitating, exactly herself. Carol asks for the biryani recipe every few months now, not to copy it, she's told me more than once, but because she genuinely likes making it, like standing in a kitchen that isn't hers, learning something patiently from a woman she once let herself doubt. Last Sunday, almost exactly a year after that dinner, we were all back at the Whitfield house again, the whole table full. Gary telling his story about the blizzard of '78 for what must be the 200th time. Grant laughing at the same moment he always laughs. Carol correcting one small detail of the story the way she always does. My mother carried the biryani in herself, both hands wrapped around the pot the same way she always has, and set it in the center of the table without a word, because there was nothing left that needed saying about it anymore. Priya, 17 now, filmed the whole dinner again for a new school project. This one about family recipes instead of family tension, and nobody at that table flinched at the camera the way we all might have quietly a year before. Daniel served himself first, the way he used to before Bethany, a full plate, seconds before anyone else had finished their firsts, and caught my eye across the table like he knew exactly what that meant to me. Here's the thing I understand now that I didn't understand at that table back in September, holding that folder with my hands shaking underneath my calm. Bethany called my mother's cooking foreign garbage because she needed everyone to believe it was beneath her, so that no one would ever ask why she kept coming back for more. But you can't actually destroy something by pretending to hate it while secretly living off it. You can only destroy your own credibility, piece by piece, one contradiction at a time, until the proof simply catches up with the performance. Contempt, it turns out, is a hard thing to fake convincingly for very long, because the truth keeps leaking out through the cracks. In a second helping, a 5-star review, a folder with your own son-in-law's name on it that was never really about him at all. I lost something that year too, even with everything that came out in our favor. I lost the easy, uncomplicated version of a family I thought I'd married into. The one where every Sunday dinner was just a Sunday dinner, and nobody needed a folder of evidence to prove they belonged at their own table. I don't know if that version was ever entirely real, or if I simply chose not to look too closely at the cracks while they were still small. Either way, it's gone now, and some quiet part of me still misses it. The way you miss anything you believed in before you learned exactly what it was made of. What I have instead is something steadier, hard-won instead of handed to me. A mother whose food finally gets to exist without apology at every table it's served on. A husband who learned, the difficult way, what it costs to let someone else write the story of the people who love him. A mother-in-law who chose truth over comfort once it actually mattered. A brother-in-law who still shows up every Sunday, quietly trying to earn back something he isn't sure he deserves yet. And a folder, still sitting in a drawer in my office, that I keep not because I need the proof anymore, but because it reminds me what it costs to stay quiet too long, and what it's worth to finally stop. I don't open it much these days. I don't need to. But I like knowing it's there. The way you like knowing a smoke detector works even after the fire's long out. Foreign garbage, she called it, in front of the whole family, certain nobody would ever prove otherwise. She had absolutely no idea what was already sitting in my car.